ironic about the story of Joseph, I must say that it is probably my favorite story in the Bible. Well, in the Old Testament at least, although I have many that I really enjoy. There's something about the story of Joseph that is just considered one of the best stories in all of literature. And it certainly shows the faithfulness of God and yet the dealings of God, how He will allow a man to suffer great things before He brings him into His honor and His glory. And in fact, in this story, suffering is seen as a means to the end of being glorified, and that is certainly a New Testament theme. And while the story of Joseph is one of my favorites, it ironically is the one story in all the Bible that if I could avoid teaching, I would. And that is only because I can never teach it through without getting choked up. And it's somewhat, it makes me somewhat self-conscious when I'm teaching it, because I'm not generally given to overt emotionalism when I teach. And yet, no matter how familiar I become with this story, there are parts of it that I cannot read aloud or even silently or even think about without getting a little bit choked up and even sometimes tears coming to my eyes. Even this morning I was reading the story and just thinking about the story again, and it had the same impact. I don't know whether any of you have the same experience, but to me, the speech of Judah, and especially at the point where Joseph discloses his identity to his brothers, in the end is one of the most powerful and moving parts of the Scripture. So it's kind of ironic that though it's one of my favorite stories, or maybe my very favorite story, yet it's one of the ones that I don't look forward to reading, because I always wonder what degree my composure will be lost in the process. And I don't even know what it is about the story that does that. I think it's just the anointing, to tell you the truth, because I mean, there are stories to which I can relate more closely than this one. I've never been through what Joseph went through. It's not as though I, personally relate with Joseph so much, or with his brothers, or anything like that. It's just something about the story that there's a certain part of it that just always gets me. And probably the other story that comes closest to it is the story of the offering of Isaac by his father Abraham. But that I can relate a little bit to, having an only son at this point and so forth, or even for many years with my daughter, I had an only child. And, the feelings that a father has toward his children, I can relate to. But the story of Joseph and his brothers, I don't have a lot of brothers or anything like that. And my relations with my brother, the one brother I have not been anything like the relations between Joseph and his brothers. So it's not as though I relate to it. It's just something that you can just see Jesus in it, is what I see. And that's the other thing that's ironic about this story, is that it seems to me Joseph is as clear a type of Christ as any character in the Bible. And yet, ironically, he is one person who is never mentioned as a type of Christ in the New Testament. There are many more obscure types of Christ, like the fact that Adam is said to be a type of Christ in the New Testament. But someone like Joseph, who, as we read his story, we'll see again and again so many direct parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ and the ministry of Christ, yet he's never mentioned as such in the New Testament. And of course, the New Testament is that from which we derive the authority for saying such and such is a type of Christ. Without such a statement in the New Testament, we cannot dogmatically say this is a type of Christ. And yet, we can hardly avoid the conclusion as we read the story. There are one writer that I once read listed something like 30 parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ. There are more parallels between Joseph and Christ than between Christ and any other character in the Old Testament. Probably the other one that comes closest would be David, who there are many parallels between. But the New Testament clearly says that David was a type of Christ. Maybe the reason that the New Testament does not identify Joseph as a type of Christ is because it's so obvious we didn't need that revelation. Whereas we might not have seen Isaac or Adam as types of Christ if we hadn't been told. Yet Joseph is so clearly so, the New Testament writers have not seen it necessary to give a special revelation on it, because the fact is self-evident. At any rate, the story of Joseph begins in chapter 37 and ends at the end of the book of Genesis. Chapter 38, we already said, is an excursus. It tells something about the genealogy of Judah's line, and particularly the genealogy of Christ. We took that as a separate chapter because it does seem to deviate from the flow of the story of Joseph. And we will take chapter 37 and then chapter 39 and the chapters that follow in that order, having already discussed chapter 38. At this point, there's another somewhat significant turn in the narrative. Until this point, we have been reading the personal history of individual men of God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've basically had the stories of individuals. Now, the real emphasis of Scripture from this point on is on the sons of Israel. Although Joseph stands out very prominently in this story, yet the sons of Israel are all, in a sense, equally prominent because they give rise to the 12 tribes, which later were known as the nation of Israel. And, of course, the nation of Israel is the main theme of the rest of the Old Testament in many respects. So, we now have come to the point where we're not dealing with just individuals. We're not just dealing with one man and then his one son Isaac and then his one son Jacob, where one son is isolated from the others. For instance, Isaac was isolated from Ishmael and the sons of Keturah. Jacob was isolated from Esau, his brother. You might feel as you read this that Joseph is isolated from his other brothers, but not really so. It's just that his role in the story is somewhat striking, and the telling of his story is more interesting than the telling of any of the other brothers' story. However, he is not really more significant than the other brothers, in that he didn't really even get the birthright, as far as that goes. We find very early in his story, however, that his father intended for him to have the birthright, and in a natural sense, he did get the birthright. You know, the birthright, as I mentioned, which was usually conferred upon the oldest son, had, in the case of this particular family, two aspects. There was the natural and the spiritual aspects. The natural aspects of the birthright were those which were associated with any birthright of any family in those days. The oldest son, who had the birthright, would normally get a double portion of the material inheritance of his father. And that would be the primary benefit of having the birthright. That's a natural and temporal benefit only, of course. And in this family's case, there was a spiritual benefit as well, because, of course, the family was in the direct lineage of the Messiah. And the spiritual birthright was to be the ancestor of the Messiah. In the case of Jacob's sons, the birthright was divided up between two men. Remember, Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel. Rachel was his favorite, but it would seem that Leah was God's choice for him. Leah had 6 sons, of whom the first 3 were disqualified from having the birthright. Though they were the oldest sons of Jacob, they were disqualified for their conduct. The 4th of them was Judah. And he was the 4th son of Jacob and also a son of Leah, who was, of course, God's choice of wife for Jacob. And it was upon Judah that God conferred the spiritual birthright of the family, because it was Judah through whom Jesus came. It was Judah who gave rise to the whole royal line of David and so forth. And it's very evident that Judah was God's choice to have the spiritual aspects of the birthright. And yet, because God does honor a father's wishes toward his children to such a great degree, and since Jacob, in his carnality, or maybe just in his sentimentality, favored Joseph, because Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel. Remember, Jacob loved Rachel. He didn't love Leah. Jacob always preferred Rachel, and therefore her firstborn son was the one that he would rather give the birthright to, and that was Joseph. And by giving Joseph a coat of many colors, which he did early on in the story, this is seen as a clear indication that he intended to give Joseph the birthright. The coat of many colors was actually a tunic that hung down to the ground. It was not an ordinary garment such as other people would wear. It was more of a princely garment, such as we find depicted on the monuments of ancient Egypt and ancient Semitic ruins. The princes would wear these long tunics with these brightly colored stripes, which most people would just wear solid colored clothing. And so the bestowal of a coat or a tunic of many colors upon Joseph indicated Jacob's intention of giving him the birthright because of Jacob's particular favoritism toward Joseph as the firstborn son of Rachel. Furthermore, even to Jacob's dying day, he was determined to give part of the birthright to Joseph. Because on his deathbed, and it's actually in chapter 48, I believe, of Genesis, Jacob calls Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, into his bedchamber, and he blesses Manasseh and Ephraim, and he adopts them. Now, although Manasseh and Ephraim were grandsons of Jacob, Jacob adopted them as full sons. Now, what that meant was that the inheritance, therefore, would be divided not among 12, but among 13. Because the one tribe of Joseph was now divided into two full tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so that by doing this, of course, when the land was divided later among the tribes, Ephraim got a portion, Manasseh got a portion, and each of the other sons got a portion, so the two sons of Joseph actually got together a double portion. By elevating each of these grandsons to the status of a full son, which took place in Genesis 48, Jacob assured that Joseph would in fact get the double portion of the inheritance. So Joseph got the temporal birthright, the natural aspects of the birthright, because Jacob desired it so, but God had bestowed it upon the son of Leah, Judah, and so we see the birthright in this family was divided up. Now, it's interesting that in the story, Judah really turns out to be the most commendable of all the other sons besides Joseph in the story, though not at first, yet in the end, Judah really shows himself to be one who's willing to lay down his life for his brother. And that's what's really exciting about this story, to see how much the man changed from the beginning to the end of the story. It says in chapter 37 and verse 1, "And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father had been a stranger in the land of Canaan. And these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report." So he was a tattletale. That didn't endear him to his brothers. And, of course, they were not especially fond of him anyway. And so the fact that he would report on them of their evil conduct, what they were doing that was evil, we don't know, but they must have been irreverent, or maybe they were stealing. We don't know, but we know that the sons of Leah were not exactly good guys, and now we find that the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah were bad too. Joseph apparently standing out as the more righteous of all the sons, the most righteous, yet not exactly humble, not exactly redemptive toward his brothers, but rather it would appear somewhat self-righteous at first, though he was very much broken through the afflictions that he suffered. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat or a tunic of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Actually, in the Hebrew, where it says they could not speak peaceably unto him, it actually says they could not speak unto him unto peace, which simply means they could not give the traditional Oriental greeting, "Peace be unto you," to him. They just couldn't bring themselves to say that. Ordinarily, when parties in the Orient, in that part of the Orient would meet, they would simply greet one another with "Peace be unto you," or in the case of the Semites, probably "Shalom," which is the same thing. But they could not address Joseph. They just couldn't do that. When they met him, they'd just be silent. They wouldn't wish peace upon him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, "Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood around about, and made obeisance to my sheaf." That means they bowed down to his sheaf. And his brethren said to him, "Shalt thou indeed reign over us?" As they understood properly the meaning of the dream, that they would bow down to him. "Or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us?" And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. They didn't like his dreams, but they also hated his words, implying that even with his words, he kind of rubbed it in, that he was chosen. Now, he could have been a petulant young boy in a family of 12 sons where he was given the clear favoritism. It could easily have gone to his head, and then having these dreams where he obviously had the ascendancy over his brothers. We don't have clear evidence that Joseph was a very humble boy, though he certainly was a godly man later on. Now, we can't read too much into this about Joseph's attitude either. I mean, he may have been just naive and just said, hey, I had an interesting dream, and then he didn't intend for it to be a boast, but it turned out that they were offended by it. It says, and he dreamed yet another dream, and told it to his brethren, and said, behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. Which obviously sounded even more as if he had delusions of grandeur. Not only the sheaves representing his brothers would bow down to him, but the sun and the moon and the stars, the heavenly bodies, would bow down to him, as though he would have some cosmic, universal glory bestowed upon him. And his father rebuked him on that occasion and said unto him, what is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come and bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? So, Jacob saw this as even Jacob was a little upset here. However, it says, and his brethren envied him, but his father observed the same. That is, his father somewhat was disturbed and almost said, you're a little out of line here, suggesting that even your father and mother, representing the sun and the moon, and the 11 stars being his 11 brothers, that they would bow down to him. He says that's a little out of line. However, Jacob didn't throw it out entirely. His brothers simply used it as an occasion for jealousy and envy and hatred of their brother. Jacob, however, of course, already being favorable toward Joseph, began to wonder whether there was some prophetic insight in these dreams. And of course, we now know there was, because it turned out that the brothers did eventually bow down to Joseph, though they didn't realize they were doing so at the time, later on in the story. So Joseph had a vision of greatness, a vision of being a ruler over his brethren, but just like so many other men in the Scripture who had a vision of God's ultimate purpose for them, he had to experience the death of a vision so that God could resurrect it. We talked about how Abraham had this vision of Ishmael being the seed through whom all would be blessed, but he had to die to that. And then God gave him a new son, Isaac. Later on, we find, of course, Moses having a vision of being a deliverer of his people, and he smites an Egyptian, but then that turns out to be counterproductive, and he's thrust out into the wilderness for 40 years, and later God revives that vision and actually calls him and enables him to do that thing which he had envisioned for himself to do. And of course we find this to be a pattern in the lives of godly men throughout the Scripture, David included. David was anointed to be king, but shortly thereafter, he had to go and flee and live in caves and live in the wilderness as Saul pursued him. It looked like his anointing was not going to come to pass, but of course God brought it to pass later. And even the disciples of Jesus had to experience the death of their vision as they saw in Jesus their hope of glory. They saw in him the one where perhaps a couple of them would sit at his right hand, his left hand in his kingdom, and they'd share in his glory and his dominion. However, their hopes were dashed when they saw him crucified. And they assumed that their vision would not come to fulfillment at all. But in the resurrection of Christ, we see it was a resurrected vision also. So frequently, this is the case. The Apostle Paul seems to have had a death of a vision as well. When he first got converted in Damascus, he began to preach the gospel. But it turned out to be very abortive, and he had to sneak out of the city through a window in a basket to escape for his life. And then he ended up spending some 14 years in Arabia, doing, as far as we know, nothing of significance. And it wasn't until somewhat later that Barnabas, who was a friend of the apostles, looked up Paul and brought him to Antioch, and there Paul began to be really launched into his ministry. But he spent many years, after his first abortive attempt to start in the ministry in Damascus, he spent many years in basically obscurity. And so, many times God will give a man a true vision of what his future holds and what of his spiritual ministry is going to be. And I even, on an earlier occasion, cited some modern examples. But usually, God will put that vision to the test, just as he asked Abram to offer Isaac on the altar, to see if the man would allow the vision to die and would release his grip of that cherished goal and would actually let it die and leave it in the hands of God. And then God, of course, restores it from the dead in his time. So that was certainly to be the pattern through which Joseph would have to go as well. He had this vision of being a ruler over his brothers. Now, we don't have any reason to believe he necessarily desired to be ruler over his brothers, though he may have, we don't know. But he simply had the dreams. He didn't ask for the dreams. God gave him the dreams. And it gave him some inclination to think that he was going to have a position of grandeur. And that his brothers would honor him and would acknowledge that position. And so that came to be the dream and the vision of his heart. But as we know, he spent a good 13 years in suffering and affliction before that could come to pass. And certainly in those 13 years, it must have seemed as though that dream would never come to pass. So, verse 12 says, And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said unto him, Here am I. And he said unto him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, What seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, They are departed from here, and I heard them say, Let's go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. Now, this errand upon which Joseph was sent seems to be extremely foolish on the part of Jacob, sending his son like this. First of all, Jacob knew the murderous character of his sons. He was well aware that Simeon and Levi, at the drop of a hat, would go and massacre people against whom they had some hostility. He knew that Reuben was unreliable and unstable as water. He knew that the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah hated Joseph because of the evil report he brought. He knew that they resented him because of his coat of many colors, and yet he sends Joseph on this errand even wearing that controversial coat, just to rub salt into the wound, it would seem. He sends this boy, 17 years old, on a long journey, 50 miles, all alone, to Shechem, no less. And Shechem, of course, is the place where the name of Jacob was mud, because that's the place where the two brothers had done that violent act. And it seems almost criminally stupid of Jacob to send Joseph on this errand. One wonders whether Jacob was actually using this as a time to test the character of the brothers toward Joseph. However, it was a very risky test if that was in his mind, because it was very, very dangerous mission for Joseph. Now, Joseph seems to be quite naive in the situation. He doesn't seem to sense any danger. He comes, he doesn't find him in Shechem. Interesting bit of, historic trivia, because it doesn't seem to have any bearing on the story to say that he didn't find them in Shechem, and a man found him wandering around. He said, Where are they? And he said, I heard him say they go to Dothan. It just sounds like a bit of detail that absolutely is unnecessary to the plot, but is included simply because it's a truthful account. And so he goes to find them in Dothan. Now, Dothan was a city, I believe, about 12 miles from Samaria. Samaria later became the capital of the northern kingdom, when the kingdom divided in the days of Rehoboam into two, into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Samaria became the capital of that northern kingdom, and Dothan was, I think, about 12 miles from that capital city. In 2 Kings chapter 6, Elisha the prophet was in Dothan, and he was serving as a counselor to the king of the northern empire, who was in Samaria close by. And every time the king of Samaria would be threatened, because the Syrians were surrounding him and always were laying ambush for the king, Elisha the prophet would receive a revelation from God about the danger, and would tell the king of Samaria, the king of Israel, about the danger, and he would avoid the danger. And so the king of Syria began to notice a pattern here. Every time he plotted against the king of Israel heard of it and escaped the danger. So the king of Syria said, Now, wait a minute. Which of my confidants is on the side of the king of Israel? Who's leaking this information? And they said, No one is leaking the information, sire. In fact, Elisha the prophet tells the king of Israel everything that you secretly utter in your bedchamber. And so he said, Well, go out and get that Elisha the prophet then. And so they found him in Dothan. And that's where a very remarkable story is found. In this same city where Joseph was in so much peril at the hands of his brothers, Elisha the prophet found himself to be surrounded by chariots of fire. It was in Dothan that the armies of Syria surrounded the city to take Elisha. And Elisha's servant Gehazi went out on the wall and saw the Syrians and was terrified. And Elisha said, "Oh, Lord, open his eyes." And his spiritual eyes were open so that he could see the spiritual armies of angels surrounding him, chariots of fire lining the hills. And, you know, it was right there in Dothan that the spiritual hosts were visibly seen by Elisha and his servant protecting him. Here at the same city, the same place, Joseph falls into the hands of his brethren. But if he could have his eyes opened, as Elisha's servant had in the same spot, he would certainly have seen that he was not really at the mercy of his brothers, because the angel of the Lord encamps around about them that fear him and delivers him, says the Psalm. One of the Psalms, that's Psalm 34 and verse 7, I believe it is. And another Psalm, Psalm 91, says, "He hath given his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone." And so the promise of the Old Testament as well as the New is that the angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister to those who are to be the heirs of salvation. Hebrews 1:14. So here the angels of God were certainly present with Joseph as they later would be in the same spot with Elisha. But their agency was not felt in this situation, because rather than deliverance, Joseph seemed to experience captivity. And it was the beginning of a period of 13 years of affliction for Joseph. Though he later, at the end of that time, recognized that it had been the hand of God that had brought it upon him. And if he had seen it clearly at this time, he would have realized that all that befell him at the hands of his brothers was not due to the absence of God's protection and the absence of God's angelic host, but rather in spite of the fact, or because they were there and because God was ordering circumstances, that this all happened. Verse 18 says, "And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him." They recognized him in the distance because he had this coat of many colors on. And that was like a red flag to them. "And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Behold now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit." These guys were unscrupulous. "And we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams then." Notice, they're afraid of his dreams. They envied him for his dreams. When they think of him, what do they call him? The dreamer. Now, they don't say, "Here comes daddy's boy," or "Here comes the favorite," or "Here comes this or that." There are many things that they objected to about Joseph, but the one thing that stuck out in their mind was his dreams. That just haunted them. That ate at them, because they suspected that they were true. Remember, they said, "Shall we certainly bow down to you?" Never. We'll never do that. They were determined not to allow the purpose of God in this to ever find fulfillment. When they saw him coming, what did they call him? "Here comes the dreamer." And then they said, "Let's kill him, then we'll see what happens to his dreams. We'll see if those dreams can be fulfilled." They thought that they would thwart the purpose of God. However, in this case, Joseph had a weak advocate in the person of the oldest son, Reuben. Since Reuben was the oldest, he did have some influence with his brothers. But he did not use that influence exactly in a strong way. He apparently was somewhat intimidated by his brothers. Seeing their murderous intent, perhaps he thought if he would come out strongly in favor of Joseph, they might just do the same to him as they planned to do to Joseph. But he did suggest an alternate plan. It says, "And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands and deliver him to the father again." Now, what he's suggesting is, don't kill him and throw him into the pit, just throw him into the pit alive. That way we don't have to have blood on our hands, specifically. And also, it suggests he die a lingering death instead of a sudden death. If you really want to punish this guy, throw him alive into the pit. Now, it was really Reuben's secret intention to sneak back at night and pull Joseph out. It says he desired to deliver him to his father again. Reuben at least had enough scruples to not want to kill his brother and to want to save him, but he did not come right out and say, "Let's save his life." He just said, "Let's throw him into a pit," from which he hoped to rescue him. However, apparently it was in Reuben's absence that the brothers sold Joseph when a traveling band of merchants came along, and they saw an opportunity. Well, why get rid of our brother and not be any richer for it? Why not sell him? We'll kill two birds with one stone. We'll get some money out of the deal too. Verse 23, "And it came to pass when Joseph was come into his brethren, They stripped Joseph out of his coat, and his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. These pits, or cisterns in the Middle East, are abundant. They are sort of a beaker-shaped pit. They're wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. And sometimes they have water in them. Sometimes they're wells. Other times they're dry wells. In this case, it was a dry well. In Jeremiah's day, there was also a similar dry well that was a pit like this. And he was thrown into it as a prison. Such pits in the Middle East are sometimes used as hiding places or even prisons, temporary prisons, if they're dry. Because of the slant of the walls, it would be impossible to climb out. The base of the wells, some of them are as much as 100 feet broad, and then narrowing at the top to a small thing. It's obvious you'd have to climb upside down like a fly on the ceiling to get out of one of those things. So it made an effective prison. The only way to get out would be to have someone lower a rope to you. And so he was thrown in this dry well. And verse 25 says, "And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt." The course from Gilead to Egypt is sometimes called the world-old trade route. That is, as long as there has been recorded history, there have been caravans on this route between Gilead and Egypt. Egypt being one of the early commercial centers, and Gilead being one of the early produce centers of the ancient world. It mentions they were bringing balm. Balm, of course, is something, an ointment that would be put upon sores to promote healing. You might remember that later in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet reproves the people because they don't turn to God for their healing. Instead, they go to other gods. And figuratively speaking, he says, "Is there no balm in Gilead, that my people have gone after other gods and have not come to me?" Referring to the well-known fact that Gilead was a place known for its balms. And of course, God was one who was known for being able to come to people's aid if they would call upon him, and he was using that as a parallel. Here, these people, these Ishmaelites as they're called here, are traveling from Gilead. They're carrying balm and other goodies down to Egypt for trade. And Judah said unto his brethren, "What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content." Now, it sounds like Judah's a little more merciful here, and he may have been. We can't be certain of his motives. He may have just wanted to get some money out of the deal. He didn't prove to shine too much brighter than the other brothers on this occasion, because he was still involved in perpetrating the hoax on his father. And what he did to his brother was quite cruel nonetheless. In fact, in a sense, a quick death might have been more merciful than 13 years in bonds in a third world prison, which Joseph ended up spending. But still, we do find him speaking up to save his life. And whether, Judah, like Reuben, maybe Judah had secretly some good motives in it, but we can't say for sure. Then it says in verse 28, "Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen." Now, some people have seen in this a contradiction in the Scripture. We were told earlier in verse 25 and verse 27 these were Ishmaelites, which would seem to be the descendants of Ishmael. However, on this place, verse 28 says they were Midianites. And Midianites were descendants of Abraham through his other wife Keturah. In other words, they had a different genealogy altogether. Both Midianites and Ishmaelites traced their ancestry to Abraham, but they were different groups. And in saying in one place they were Ishmaelites and in another Midianites, some have felt we have here a contradiction in the Bible, and people who are desperate to find contradictions in the Bible are delighted to find something like this. Of course, those who believe that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and that the Pentateuch rather is a conglomeration of 4 different verbal traditions that were passed down for centuries and later rather sloppily converged into one narrative, find evidence for it here also. They say, see, one tradition says they were Ishmaelites, another tradition says they were Midianites, and when the two stories are put together, it sort of retains the information from both, but clearly it can't be the Word of God because the two traditions disagree with each other. Were these merchants Midianites or Ishmaelites? Well, the issue is solved completely when we realize that the word Ishmaelites came to be a generic term, rather like the word Arabs today. And Midianites spoke more specifically of their ethnic background. The relationship between the word Ishmaelite and Midianite in old times would be similar to our modern, the difference between the word Arab and Syrians. Syrians are Arabs, but then so are Egyptians, and so are Jordanians. I mean, those are all Arabs. But Syrians is a smaller group of them. And so there is no contradiction here. Certainly we would not expect either Moses writing this to be so foolish as to contradict himself so rapidly within the space of 2 verses, nor the editors of an alleged, putting together of 4 traditions to be so blind as to see that they've put the wrong information in here. We can't imagine that in any case that this is a stupid mistake on the part of a writer. We must assume that there is some way to harmonize the fact that they are called both Ishmaelites and Midianites, and in fact it's quite easily harmonizable, because if I told you that certain Arabs blew up an airplane and told you that they were Lebanese, you would not think I had contradicted myself, because the people of Lebanon are included among those that we would call Arabs. But people who are looking for trouble with the Bible find it. To lay the matter to rest entirely, we can look to the work of another writer, Judges, which was written by, we don't know whom, very possibly Samuel the prophet, at a much later time than that of Moses. But in Judges, chapter 8, in verse 24, in telling of the victory that Gideon had over the Midianites, it says in Judges 8:24, "And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that ye would give me every man the earring of his prey. For they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites." Now, this is talking about the Midianites. No, you can see that 2 verses earlier. It says in verse 22, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian." And so he says, okay, give me the earrings off the dead Midianites. And it says in parentheses, they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Now here we see very plainly that Midianites are Ishmaelites. And it also makes it plain that Ishmaelites became more of a general term than a specific term. It did not require that they be personally descended from Ishmael. Now see, it's entirely possible that Ishmael's descendants intermarried with those of Midian. They were close family relatives. Remember, Ishmael was Abram's son by Hagar. Midian was Abram's son by Keturah. So Ishmael and Midian were half-brothers. And it's very possible that in later generations their descendants intermarried so that there was quite a mix, so that Midianites and Ishmaelites were very much the same group. So we have no problem, of course, harmonizing these things. I only go so long on it because some people get stumbled by unbelievers who try to make an issue of this kind of junk. What is junk is the argument against the Bible on this, because it simply isn't based on any sound objection. Now we're back in Genesis 37:28. "Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites." And in one verse they're called Midianites and Ishmaelites, "for 20 pieces of silver," which was later the price of a common slave between the ages of, between the ages of 15 and 25 in the Jewish law. 20 pieces of silver. "And they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit." So apparently Reuben was off on an errand we're not told about, and his brothers did this transaction while Reuben was away. And when he came back hoping to deliver Joseph, he found Joseph was gone. Now, he didn't know immediately that he had been sold. He no doubt thought that Joseph had in fact died and had been removed, and so he tore his clothing, which was a sign of remorse and mourning. And he returned unto his brethren and said, "The child is not," which is generally speaking a term for meaning he's dead. He didn't know that he'd been sold. "And I, whither shall I go?" And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no." And he knew it, and he said, "It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn in pieces." And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all of his sons and all of his daughters hypocritically rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I will go down into my grave unto my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh's and the captain of his guard. Actually, the captain of his guard means, in the Hebrew, the chief of the executioners. Potiphar apparently was the head of the royal bodyguard of Pharaoh, a high-ranking official in Egypt. And Joseph originally, upon coming to Egypt, was purchased by Potiphar to be a household servant. However, things turned badly for Joseph after that. Even worse. Now, in order to deceive their father, they took this easily identifiable personal item, Joseph's coat of many colors, and they killed a goat and put the blood upon it, obviously to impersonate the blood of Joseph himself. And in saying, "We found the coat, do you recognize it?" Obviously they were saying, the man was dead before we got there, and in fact, apparently a wild animal must have dragged the body away and we found only the coat. So that they were perpetuating a hoax, which worked. They succeeded in deceiving their father, Jacob. And what's ironic about this is that it was with the blood of a goat that they deceived him, whereas in a time much earlier, Jacob himself had deceived his father with the skins of goats on his hands and on his neck. So what goes around comes around. A man reaps what he has sown, and Jacob in his earlier life had deceived his own father with the use of a goat, and now his sons end up deceiving him and bringing grief upon him through the use of a similar animal. Now, Jacob determined that he'd just die mourning. He wasn't going to be separated from his son. He's going to grieve himself to death. He said, "I'm going to go down to the grave unto my son mourning," and he wept for him. However, it was not in the providence of God for Jacob to die at this time, so he eventually had to recover. In the meantime, Joseph got sold to the Egyptians, to the house of Potiphar. Now, at this point, the narrative changes and goes off to talk about Judah's family. And we discussed that last night, so we'll pass by it. And meanwhile, back in Egypt, we find what's happening with Joseph. In chapter 39, Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. The statement, "the Lord was with Joseph," becomes an oft-repeated refrain in the story of Joseph. Excuse me. Joseph was ostensibly alone. He was taken from the home of his father, where he had been very closely nurtured and favored, where he had many brothers, where he had a strong Hebrew culture, even within the family, where he was among those who believed in Jehovah, and therefore he had certain spiritual fellowship in his home. And now he was taken to a far country, a place totally foreign to him, where a language was spoken that he didn't know, where there was no one who knew Jehovah, so he had absolutely no fellowship in the Spirit. Besides that, he was deprived of every comfort and every possession. He had been the heir apparent to the wealth of a very wealthy chieftain, his father Jacob, but now he was only a slave, having no possessions of his own. Nonetheless, despite appearances, we are told, but, a very great word, but the Lord was with him. And the Lord made him prosperous. Now, when you're a slave and don't own anything, it might be strange to be called prosperous. But in fact, Joseph was made prosperous very much in the same sense that we can be seen to be made prosperous, because Joseph was a slave, but he was very quickly made a responsible slave, a slave with responsibility. Potiphar quickly noticed the virtue and the character of the man that he had purchased on the slave market. And as was very customary for slave owners to do, he found in Joseph a good manager of his property. And he could take a big load off of his master's mind. Once you'd find a slave that you found to be a trustworthy man, it was quite a relief to be able to bestow a great deal of the household management upon him so that you don't have to do that yourself. And Joseph clearly is shown to be a very shrewd, administrative genius in the story that follows. And this showed up early in his life, and this was due to the blessing of God upon him. It wasn't just a natural ability, but he simply had wisdom beyond his years from the Lord. And this was quickly recognized, so he was made a steward. Now, as a steward of Potiphar's house, we later learn that everything Potiphar owned was in the hands of Joseph. Joseph was the manager. Potiphar didn't even ask him to give an account for how the money was spent. It's just he had Potiphar's things and he could use them as it seemed fit. However, as a steward, he knew that they were not his possessions. They were his master's possessions. Though he might appear to be a rich man, Joseph really owned nothing. He had access to a fortune, and money flowed through his hands like water, and he could order expensive items to be brought to the household, and he could sell and buy, possessions and so forth. Everything that Potiphar had was in his hand, and it says his master didn't even take an account from it. It says, though Joseph owned it all, as far as his management of it was concerned. However, in his heart, he knew he didn't own it. He knew that he, as a steward and a slave, was responsible to spend every penny the way that his master would desire, because if he did not, he would be accountable. If he would waste his master's goods in any sense, the day of reckoning would come, and he could be deprived of his stewardship, and he could even be punished more severely than that. So he had the appearance of a rich man. I'm sure in the house of Potiphar he had certain comforts. He probably had nice clothing. I'm sure he ate at the master's table and would have fared on the best food Egypt had. Yet he was entirely destitute, owning nothing. Now, the Bible says in the New Testament that a Christian is one, and must be one, if he's to be a disciple, who has forsaken all that he has. And part of becoming a Christian is accepting upon ourselves the status of a servant of the Lord. Now, truly, Jesus said, I don't call you servants, but I call you friends. Nonetheless, in Jewish society, a person could be a servant against his will for 7 years, but then in the 7th year, it was required of the master to offer release to his slaves, if he had a Hebrew slave. This was in the law. And in most cases, I imagine, slaves would rejoice to take their liberty after 7 years. But the provision was made in the law that if after 7 years a slave enjoyed being a slave, now that might seem strange to us, but in fact some men found more security in being a servant of a wealthy master if he was well treated and well provided for as such than he would find out in the world trying to support himself in the rat race. So in some cases a servant would want to stay a servant to the same man. In which case, at the end of 7 years, he would declare his intention, say, I love my master, I love my family here, I want to remain a servant to this man, and a formal ceremony would take place where the slave would be taken to the door of the house, and an awl would bore a hole in his earlobe, and he'd wear an earring forever after, which was the mark of a willing slave, one who had been offered freedom but chose to be a slave. This was called a bond slave, a bond servant. This word, bondservant, is the word which the Apostle Paul and Peter and the other writers of the epistles always used in describing themselves. They described themselves as the bondservant of Jesus Christ, which means they had been offered liberty. Jesus said, I don't call you servants, I call you friends. In a sense, he's releasing them. But they say, but we love our master. We want to be his servant. And a bondservant could never be released. Once he'd gotten that earring, it was perpetual. He'd never have another chance to be released from his slavery. And so it was a life decision a bondservant would make, and the apostles spoke of themselves as having made that decision. An irrevocable life decision of willing slavery. Now that is certainly the ideal for the Christian, is to see oneself as the bondservant of Jesus Christ. In a sense, a servant owns nothing. He's a slave. Everything he owns is his master's. But as such, if he's a faithful servant, the master may entrust him as a steward over some of his goods. So that you will find some Christians who are just as sold out to God as anyone else, who have possessions at their disposal. I'm not one of them, but I've known some, who, for one reason or another, God has deemed them faithful to have possessions, but they are not their own. And they must know that they are not their own. If they begin to act as though they are own and begin to wastefully spend them on themselves, of course their stewardship can be revoked. There's a parable about that in Luke 16. Jesus said there was a steward of whom it was reported to his master that he had wasted his goods. So he said, draw up an account, get your books in order, because you're no longer going to be a steward. Because a steward doesn't have the right to waste his master's goods, only to use them and manage them for his master's good. There are many Christians that we would have to call rich Christians, who, though we're not to be anyone's judge, God is the final judge in these matters, we would have to say it does not appear as though they're taking their stewardship seriously. Because they use the money that God has given them to feather their own nests, to build their own kingdoms, to buy themselves the chiefest comforts that money can buy, and to compete with the Joneses for status and for affluence, rather than seeing that all the financial blessing that has come to them has been given to them as a stewardship. Everything, if they are a bondservant of Jesus Christ, if they're a Christian, they do not own any of it. They have forsaken to become a Christian their own freedom and their own life and all that they have. Jesus said, whoever comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, his children, yea, his own life also cannot be my disciple. That's Luke 14, and it was a few verses later. I think that's verse 25 or 26 he said that, and then I think around verse 34 he said, so whosoever he be among you who forsaketh not all that he hath cannot be my disciple. But that doesn't mean necessarily selling everything and living like St. Francis of Assisi. It may for some, and it certainly meant that for the disciples, the original disciples, but there's nothing in the Bible that says every Christian has to live that lifestyle. We see in the book of Acts not every Christian did. And so what we would have to conclude is that in many cases, though a person has forsaken all that he has, it is a heart transaction. It is a matter of seeing, I am no longer my own, therefore obviously my possessions cannot be my own. It says in 1 Corinthians, you are not your own, you've been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. So that neither myself nor my possessions are any longer my own. I have forsaken all. I have forsaken my life also, and my family, and my possessions. And they now all belong to Jesus Christ. However, He, in some cases, will entrust me with the management of some. Juan Carlos Ortiz tells the story, probably you're familiar with it, of the pearl of great price, taken from a parable that Jesus told, where He said the kingdom of God is like a pearl of great price, which a pearl merchant found, and he knew the value of it, so with great joy he sold all of his other pearls so that he could buy the pearl of great price, implying that you have to basically forsake every other worldly thing in your heart to have the kingdom of God. Now, Juan Carlos Ortiz, in his book Disciple, kind of made a little story about that, and he depicts a pearl merchant walking through the marketplace and just seeing this enormous, gorgeous pearl on display in one of the booths, and he's just enamored by this pearl, and he comes over to it and says, you know, boy, this pearl is the most beautiful, most expensive pearl I've ever seen. And the owner says, oh yes, it's very, very expensive. And the pearl merchant says, well, I'm sure I could never afford to buy it. The merchant says, oh, sure you could afford to buy it. Anyone could afford to buy it. And he says, well, I thought you just said it was very expensive. How can you now say anyone could afford to buy it? He says, well, it is very expensive, and yet everyone can afford to buy it. And he says, well, then what is the price on the pearl? And the merchant said, everything you have. And he said, well, that's worth it. I don't have anything that's worth as much as that pearl. I'll give you everything I have for that pearl. Here, I'll give you all my pearls. So he gives him his pearls. And the merchant says, fine. Do you have anything else? He says, no, nothing. That's all I have. Well, don't you have any money on you? Well, yeah, I have a little bit in my wallet is all. He says, well, I need that too. So he shells out what money he has in his wallet, and he says, okay, now can I take my pearl? And the merchant says, well, is that really all you have? Don't you have any money in the bank? He says, well, sure, I have a little, a T-bill and, a few investments there, sure, but that's for my old age. And the merchant says, sorry, you've got to give that too. It's all that you have. So he does. He gives it, and he says, well, now you've got everything I own. And the merchant says, well, wait a minute, where do you live? He says, well, I live in a house, of course. And he says, well, then I'll take the house also. He says, what? Now I have to live in my car? Oh, you have a car. Okay. The car is mine also. Okay. And as the negotiations go on, finally the man realizes that this pearl really costs everything he has. And so finally he has absolutely no more possessions. He's turned them over to the merchant, and the merchant says, well, that's all very nice. And the man says, okay, you have all that I owned. Now do I own the pearl? And the merchant says, well, there's one other thing. Are you alone in this world? He says, no, I've got, a wife, 4 children. And the merchant says, well, they become mine too. And also, by the way, the clothes you're wearing, everything you have becomes mine. And the man says, well, okay, you've got everything now. Can I take the pearl? He says, yes, you can take the pearl now. It now belongs to you. And one other thing. This car, this house, this woman and these children, why don't you take care of them for me? I don't have any use for them. For myself. Why don't you raise these children for me? Why don't you take care of this wife for me? Why don't you administrate this house and drive this car for me? But forever after, you know that it's not yours because you've sold it all to obtain the pearl. But you can manage these things for me. But whenever I want them, they must be at my disposal. And that is a very apt illustration of what stewardship is. We've already talked before about the Old Testament concept of tithing as versus the New Testament concept of stewardship. In the Old Testament, the Jews were required to give 10% to God. The other 90% they could do whatever they wanted with. As long as they'd given God their 10%, they were free to live it up, as long as they didn't sin. In the New Testament, however, it's not 10%, it's everything. But in giving everything to God, it does not mean that every Christian lives like a pauper, because God may be willing to let you wear some shoes for Him. I might call on you to give away those shoes too. David Wilkerson gave away his pair of shoes to Nicky Cruz or to someone like that on the streets of New York in the snow and walked away barefoot because the kid had no shoes. That's just the way discipleship is. Whatever you have is God's, not yours. And if God lets you wear it, if God lets you drive it, if God lets you live in it, if God lets you manage it for a while, that's His business. But if He decides that it's no longer time for you to do that and it's time for you to turn it over to someone else, then that's none of your business either. See? You just do what your master says because everything is His. That's an exact parallel to the position that Joseph was in. Ostensibly, he owned much, but he didn't really own anything. Everything he had his hands on, though he had full control of it, he had an obligation with that control, and that obligation was to serve his master's interests with those things. Just like the manager of a shop, if it's someone other than the owner of the shop. That manager, he hires employees, he fires employees, he orders from, supplies from purveyors, he sets prices, he determines sale prices and so forth. He runs the shop as though it's his own, but it's not. It's really, he's an employee of someone else. And everything that he's controlling belongs to someone else. And if he mismanages it, that someone else is likely to fire him and get another manager. And that is a modern day counterpart to the old biblical concept of stewardship back in the days of slavery. Nothing belonged to him, but he controlled it all. And so Joseph here is a good picture of the Christian. In another sense, he's a picture of Christ because everything prospered in his hands. It says concerning Christ in Isaiah 53 that the will of God, the pleasure of the Lord would prosper in Jesus' hands. And certainly God made Jesus' ministry prosperous, not in terms of finances, because Jesus lived as a poor man, but in terms of the success of His endeavors. Jesus caused everything that Jesus said God caused everything Jesus' hand was set to prosper, obviously. He healed all the sick. He cast out all the demons. Never met a demon that could resist Him. Everything, even death couldn't hold Him down. Okay, so the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered in the house of his master the Egyptian. Verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he had, or that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer, or steward, over his house. And all that he had he put into Joseph's hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, so that he knew not aught that he had, except the bread that he did eat every day. And Joseph was a goodly, which actually means handsome person, and well-favored. Apparently, he inherited his mother's good looks, because Rachel was said to be beautiful and well-favored. So now Joseph, her son, is also a beautiful and well-favored person to look upon. And that, of course, sets the stage for the problem that arose. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph. The age-old story. And she said, lie with me. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not, or knows not, what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath into my hand. There is none greater in his house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her, or be with her. That is, he was smart enough not only to resist temptation, but to avoid being with her. However, he wasn't able to leave the house because of his duties, so he was kind of vulnerable to her coming upon him at any time. It came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. There was no one else in the house there with him. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out And it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her to keep as evidence until her husband got home. Joseph, however, went to his quarters and waited the verdict, which he knew would not go well with him. Now, the temptation here of Joseph, again, is a place in which we see him as a type of Christ. He was tempted intensely, just as Jesus was in the 3 temptations he experienced in the wilderness for those 40 days in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, and yet without sin. One thing about Joseph is there is no clear sin recorded against his record. That is not to suggest that he was personally sinless. Of course, he's a human being and had sins. And even the way he related his dreams to his brothers, we've suggested might have been in a poor attitude, but we can't be certain of it. Unlike Abraham, and unlike Isaac, and unlike Jacob, Joseph is a man against whom the writer records no sin, specific sin. And that, in that sense, though Joseph would not have been a perfect man in real life, yet according to the story, he appears like Jesus without sin. And we see him in the midst of an intense temptation, as Jesus was, and yet resisting that temptation. This is a good story to remember, especially for single young men when tempted, to remember Joseph, because this man was tempted more probably than any single man I've ever met in this area. Consider, he was 17 years old. In a sense, he was in that adolescent period where his sexual drive would be among the strongest that it would ever be. He was isolated from all spiritual influence. He never expected he'd see his family again, so he'd never have to give an account for them if he backslid. There was no one in Egypt that cared one whit about Christian morality. He'd never be called into account by man. And he could have even rationalized in some other ways. It is very possible that Potiphar, his master, was a eunuch. In most cases, the high officials in Egypt were eunuchs, which means they've been castrated. Now, in many Oriental courts, high government officials were castrated, partly because they had access to the harems of the king, and that would, of course, make sure they wouldn't get into trouble that way, but also partly just as a sign of their total dedication to their office. And you'd say, well, if he was castrated, why would he have a wife? That, too, would be just as a matter of status. To have a wife, probably a woman of high rank or a high birth, was simply another matter of status, even for a eunuch to have a wife. It would mean, however, that they would have no sexual relations. And you could see how Joseph, if the devil were speaking in his ear, could say, this poor woman, her husband can't even have relations with her. No wonder she's sexually starved, and here, it seems like there's a situation here. It's not going to hurt anyone. And, he'd have his natural drives and so forth. He could have reasoned as many modern young men, even Christian men sometimes do, in a period of temptation. But instead, he wisely avoided her altogether. In Proverbs, Solomon, who himself had a bit of a problem with women, gave counsel to his son to avoid the strange woman. He says, don't go anywhere near her house. Don't go anywhere near her door. Walk down the other streets. Go the long way around. Avoid her house completely, because that is the best counsel you can give to a young man who's got struggles in the area of sexual temptation. Paul put it this way to Timothy, who was a young man. He said, flee youthful lust. Flee fornication. And we find Joseph, even though he did not have those exhortations from Solomon or from Paul because he lived before them, yet he had the natural good sense that if he was going to preserve his sanctity before God, he was going to have to flee the temptation itself. Some people like to walk as close to temptation as they can because they like to get a little bit titillated. They don't really want to fall. They've got convictions against that, but they do kind of want to be teased a little bit. I don't know why that is, but there's a certain sense in which people who really have no intentions of committing sexual crimes still like to go to dirty movies. They get a certain amount of titillation out of that. People who are fasting and know they're determined not to eat still like to sometimes smell the pie in the oven, and You know, it's just the stupidity of our fallen nature that we like to torture ourselves. I mean, for a man to look at a woman with lust is just self-torture, because in most cases he's not going to have her. There are some men who spend their whole day sitting on benches watching the women go by. It's obvious they're not going to have those women. So why arouse oneself? Why torture yourself? It's just the stupidity of fallen nature. The person who is not godly in the Scripture, and especially in Proverbs, is referred to as the fool. And he is a fool because he doesn't understand the nature of sin and temptation. Joseph is remembered as a wise man. None so wise as he, said the Pharaoh. And one of the points of his wisdom that is evident is in that he did not desire to flatter himself. Though determined to reject her overtures, he could have considered a personal flattery that this high-ranking and probably beautiful woman was constantly making overtures at him. I mean, some men would kind of like that. It's good for the ego. He had no interest in nurturing his ego in that way. He fled from every situation that he could, but he was not able, of course, simply to not go around the house. She lived there, and he worked there, and he was a slave. He couldn't take another job somewhere else if he wanted to. He was stuck there. So he was really under the gun. He was really put through the fiery trial. When you think about it, Joseph was tempted in all ways like as we are, yet without sin when you study his story. What did he suffer? He suffered intense temptation. He suffered misunderstanding. He suffered the jealousy, unwarranted jealousy of his brethren. He suffered physical pain. He suffered many things. And this is one of them. When he experienced them intensely. He was wise enough to avoid her as much as he could. However, on one occasion, he found himself totally in a circumstance beyond his control. She grabbed him. She tried to forcibly get him to come to her bed. Though he must certainly have been greatly tempted at that moment, he fled. And in so doing, he risked getting in bigger trouble than if he had succumbed. If he had succumbed, she no doubt would have gladly continued having an affair with him and kept it under her hat. But in leaving his garment in her hands and risking her rage, he certainly must have known he was making himself very vulnerable. And as soon as he escaped her and came to his quarters and probably locked himself in until he waited to see the issue of the matter, he probably, through his mind, thought of all the horrible things that were probably going to happen to him because of his obedience to God. Remember, when she had tempted him, remember how he argued against her? He says, listen, my master has shown me so much grace. He's given me everything. He hasn't withheld anything from me except you. There's no one in the household with a higher rank than myself. I'm the object of my master's grace. How can you expect me to take you also from him? He said, how can I do this thing and sin against God? It's interesting. He didn't say, the way he builds it up, you think he's going to say, how could I sin against my master who's been so good to me? But he sees in this that the real affront would not be against his master, but against God. And that's an important point. If we see our sins only in terms of how they will affect other people, we can almost always justify them, especially adultery. Because people who are adulterers almost always assume that their sin won't be found out. It's amazing how often they're wrong about that. But they probably assume that what they do will be done secretly and never be found out. And they figure, it's not really going to hurt the husband. What he doesn't know isn't going to hurt him. That's the way they reason. And as long as we're reasoning ourselves into righteous conduct on the basis of whether or not it's going to hurt someone else, we can always rationalize ourselves into sinning. We can rob a bank, say, well, the bank, they're richer than I am. They're insured anyway, and those insurance companies are just a rip-off. They're just getting rich off poor people like me. So, I can rob a bank as far as that goes, and I'm not really hurting the little guy. It's these big fat cats that are getting hurt, and they're not really getting hurt because they're insured to the nose. So, you can justify any sin if you just think about, even murder. Well, the guy, the guy's got a miserable life anyway. I'll just kill him and put him out of his misery, A lot of times we try to advocate holiness, and we advocate it on the wrong grounds. I know many parents trying to get their young teenage girls to avoid sexual sin will use all the wrong reasons. You could get pregnant. You could get venereal disease. You might get your heart broken, or whatever. None of those are the right reasons. Because if a child is raised thinking that those are the reasons to be holy, then they can, really what it makes it sound like is if I can rationalize around those reasons so that I don't get pregnant, so that I don't get venereal disease, so that I don't get my heart broken, or at least if I do, that's a risk I'm willing to take, well, then they can reason themselves into the rightness of their actions and do what's wrong. But those are not the right reasons for avoiding fornication or any other sin. When Paul argues to avoid fornication, in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, "What? Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I take the members of Christ and join them to a harlot? You are not your own. You've been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body, in your spirit, which are His." In other words, we avoid fornication not because it's going to hurt us or someone else, although he does say a fornicator hurts himself. We avoid it because it offends the holiness of God. God who owns us. God who has the right to tell us what to do because He not only made us, but later purchased us. We're not our own. If we sin using these bodies that belong to God for something that is against God's will, we are ripping Him off, our rightful owner. It's like a slave robbing from his master. Only our master in this case is God. Therefore, no matter how much we can justify actions on other grounds, we can never get around the fact that every sin is ripping off God. And we cannot change that. We cannot rationalize around it. We cannot somehow sin in a way that avoids doing that. And that is the real motive and the real strength in resisting temptation. Realizing that if I sin, I am wronging God. I'm violating God, and there's no way I can sin without doing so. And that realization is the only true reason to avoid sin, because we're supposed to do whatever we do for the glory of God. Obviously, if we sin, we're not doing that to the glory of God. Joseph wisely called upon the same principle. He didn't say, think of all the good things my master has done. How can I sin against my master after he's been so good to me? He said, how can I do this wicked thing and sin against God? And he remembered that even though he was totally devoid of Christian fellowship, as we would say, nonetheless, he was answerable to God. The Lord was certainly with him, prospering what was in his hand. He had evidence enough that God was with him. And so he plainly said that he would not do it for this reason and for this reason alone, that he would not offend God. Now it says, finally, she kept his garment till the husband came home. And it says in verse 17, she spoke unto him, that is her husband, according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. In other words, to attempt to rape me. And it came to pass, as I was lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard these words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant unto me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Now, I don't believe the husband believed his wife. He knew his wife, what kind of woman she was. He also knew what kind of man Joseph was. If he really believed that Joseph was guilty of trying to rape his wife, he wouldn't have just put him in prison. Hey, this guy was the chief of the executioners. What do you think the penalty should be for a slave who tried to rape his master's wife, a woman of high rank? It would obviously be death. The fact that his master put him into prison, and by the way, since he was the captain of the guard, in a sense Potiphar had oversight of the prison itself, and Joseph was there exalted in the prison also. It's clear that Potiphar did not really believe the report of his wife. So why did he punish Joseph? He punished Joseph because he had no choice. There was a scandal. He couldn't prove his wife wrong. And if he would say, I believe my slave instead of believing my wife, that would be just socially totally unacceptable to put the word of a slave over the word of a free person, especially his wife. And that's why his wrath was kindled. Notice it doesn't say his wrath was kindled against Joseph. And it doesn't even say it was kindled against his wife. It was just kindled. He just got angry. Why? Because he saw he's in a pinch. Here's this guy, Joseph, who's the best thing that ever happened to him. As soon as he put Joseph in charge of the house, everything prospered. The guy was getting rich. And now his wife has brought this thing up, which is forcing him to take action against Joseph, which he didn't prefer to do. It was obviously going to mean that he's going to find another manager of his household who probably wouldn't do as good a job. And it was just putting him out. But he was going to have to do something, so he put Joseph in prison just as a token gesture of punishment. This would, of course, appease his wife somewhat and it would save face socially. But I think when it says his wrath was kindled in verse 19, it was not against Joseph, but just he was angry because of this situation arising. By the way, that the whole problem in the matter was, and the reason Joseph had to go to prison is because there was no third party to testify in Joseph's behalf. Joseph no doubt protested his innocence. We don't have any record of whether he did or not, but I'm sure he must have. But still, it was just his word against the woman's, and what can you do in a case like that? You know, this syndrome, the Potiphar's wife syndrome, is kind of a common thing. Especially with counselors and pastors. I know of many cases where pastors have been accused, or at least have become vulnerable to accusation by women because they counseled women alone and there was no third party present to verify what went on there. And my mother, for instance, was in a church when she was young, a Baptist church, where the pastor was accused by a woman of doing something, either propositioning her or sleeping with her or something. And most of the people in the church who knew the pastor were quite convinced he was innocent. But there was no third party to verify it. And so what could they do? They couldn't just say, well, we're going to ignore this thing. And finally, the pastor had to leave the church because even though much of the church was convinced that he was innocent, the scandal couldn't be disproven, and therefore, he couldn't stay in the area. There'd always be suspicion about him and so forth. So it kind of ruined his ministry in that place. And I've known of many other cases. Of course, in some cases, the pastors actually have succumbed to women. But in the cases even where they don't. See, there's a danger in counseling women privately. For a man to counsel a woman privately, it can be very dangerous. Because in many cases, the attachment that grows between a counselor and the counselee, especially if they're opposite sexes, develops into an emotional bonding that is easily transferred into a romantic feeling, and very often affairs have resulted from that kind of situation. But even if they don't, you never know if the woman that you're counseling is going to lie about you. And you might say, well, why in the world would she? I don't know. I don't know why women do the things they do. I'm not a woman, but I know that this has happened historically before, and ask a woman why they might do that. I hope that the women here would never do such a thing anyway, but maybe they can't relate to why a woman would do that either. But it is simply known as a fact that it has happened on many occasions. Therefore, it is considered a wise ministerial practice to always have a third party, preferably another woman present when a man is counseling a woman. In many cases, if a woman has to counsel privately with the pastor will have his secretary close to the door. And there have been cases that I've heard of where a woman came to a pastor and actually tried to seduce him, where he would immediately stand up and walk out to his secretary and call her in and say, and tell the woman, repeat to my secretary what you just repeated to me, and so forth, and just get the thing cleared up. It's a mess. It's a messy thing. And generally the best practice is for women to counsel women and for men to counsel men, though sometimes you're just in a position that can't happen. There have been cases, of course, where there's no other option but for a man to talk privately to a woman. In those cases, it's best to do it in an open space or in a place where there's a lot of windows or something like that, so that you're walking in the light, just so you're walking in the light, and your deeds, you don't have to be afraid of them being reproved. There is a interesting thing in Paul's counsel to Titus, who was a young minister, in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, Paul gives this young minister instructions about how to deal with the various people in his congregation in Crete. And he says at the beginning of that chapter, Titus 2, "But speak thou the things which become sound doctrine, that the aged men be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity, and patience. The aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded." Now, notice, there are 4 categories of people that Titus is to minister to and to communicate and teach and counsel. There are old men and young men. There are old women and young women. He says, counsel the old men to do this. Counsel the young men to do that. Counsel the old women to do this so that they can counsel the young women. You notice that? You teach the old men, you teach the young men, you teach the old women, but let the old women teach the young women. That's what he says. You, young man, stay away from the sisters. And that was good pastoral counsel coming from an aged apostle who had seen a lot and knew the dangers. And the ideal situation, of course, is when you can have an older Christian sister who is experienced in the Lord and instructed and wise in the things of God, to whom younger sisters can go for counsel. One of the big problems we have in our day and age is that much of the counsel young sisters would get from older sisters now in the church is not the counsel that Paul said they should get. Remember, he said the old women should teach the young women to be keepers at home. Homemakers. Not career women, but homemakers. Lovers of their children, lovers of their husbands. How many women are even homemakers but don't love the job? They don't love their children. I know some Christian women who are doing their duty in raising their children but have no great delight in it. And yet an older woman is supposed to inspire such things in a younger woman, to disciple the young women, to be mothers, to be keepers at home, to be chaste and discreet, to not sit around watching soap operas and eating bonbons. But many times the older women in our society, in the churches, have been improperly trained themselves. Our women of our generation are not the first generation to get the wrong kind of training. So many times, if we send the young women to old women, they're going to get bad counsel because the old women, when they were young women, got bad counsel. And I believe that in our generation, God is raising up a whole new breed of what will be the old women of the future, who are starting from scratch. There are very, very few. There are not none, but there are very few old women that you can really, with confidence, send a young woman to and know that she's going to get the very counsel that Paul said that they should get from the older women. So what I believe God is doing now, and I've seen it for a number of years now, is that women of our age, who are certainly not old women yet they are learning from scratch what a woman's role is to be. Going back to what was known a couple generations back, what's always been taught in the Scripture, and they are learning it, applying it, and someday they're going to be old women who teach the next generation of young women if the Lord tarries. Anyway, the counsel to Titus was, you let the old women counsel the young girls. Avoid counseling a young woman. I have never gotten into trouble in a situation like that, but there were some cases where there was potential for it, and I was glad that the Lord kept me from it, and I've learned some things about protocol since then. In verse 21 then, the Lord was with Joseph, even in prison, and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. This was probably a subordinate to Potiphar, the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. So the same thing happened to him in prison that happened in Potiphar's house. Ultimately, someone would notice what kind of a man he was and say, I'm going to give you most of my duties. The keeper of the prison had all these duties. He said, hey, you're a good prisoner. You're an honest man. I think I'll let you feed these guys. I'll let you, tend to them and so forth. And so Joseph, wherever he went, God blessed him and he was elevated. He was sort of one of these guys who couldn't be held down. And so whatever he did, or whatever they did there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison looked not on anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Okay, I'd like to take quickly chapter 40, because in it, one thing in particular, there's just one development that happens, and that is that two of Pharaoh's not cabinet members, but officials, the chief of the butlers, which would be the main cupbearer for the king, and the chief of the bakers, 3 days before the Pharaoh's birthday, both of these men are accused of some crime. Now, their crime is not related. We don't know what their crime was, but it's interesting. One was the cupbearer and one was the baker. The cupbearer was the man who would taste the wine and bear the cup to the king. Many times in ancient world, and probably in the modern world, there are many intrigues against rulers where people would attempt to poison them, and that's why they have a cupbearer. The cupbearer would taste the wine first. If it was poison, he'd drop over dead, and the king wouldn't drink the wine. So the cupbearer sort of had his life in the king's hand. On the other hand, the cupbearer was the one man to whom the king was most vulnerable, because the cupbearer really prepared the wine and so forth, and he could, there's some way that he could, the hand could be quicker than the eye, and he could possibly pass off to the king a poisoned cup. besides which the cupbearer also was, in many cases, had the key to the king's personal chambers, which would make, of course, him have to be a trusted official too. The baker and the cupbearer were both in the position to give food to the king. King's birthday was coming up in 3 days. It's very possible that both of these men were accused of being involved in a plot against the king's life. There was a big party coming up. It's quite possible, I'm speculating, but it's very reasonable to assume that somewhere in the kitchen someone had found a stash of poison. And it wasn't yet clear who was plotting. It might have been the cupbearer and it might have been the baker, but until the truth of the matter could be found out, they were both shut up in prison. And as it turned out, you find the butler was released because he was found to be innocent. As evidence turned up, he was allowed to be released and put back into his old duties. However, the baker was hanged, which suggests that the evidence that came out indicated that he was the culprit. Well, of course, a lot of that is reading between the lines because we're not told what their crime was. We're just told that they have to be put in the same prison with Joseph. And this later is, of course, laying the foundation for an important development at a later point in the story. It came to pass that after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. The Pharaoh was wroth against the two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. That is, he served them, and they continued for a season in ward. They dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker and of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were very sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward in the Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sad today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me. Now remember, he bore the cup of wine, generally speaking, so his dream had a vine from which came wine. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossom shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Excuse me. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee to thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the hand of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing, that they should put me into this dungeon. Now, the first man to tell his dream actually was innocent, and later was restored, and his dream indicated his innocence. And Joseph interpreted. Both dreams had something in common, but in the case of the butler's, or the baker's dream later, it turns out that he was a guilty man, and his message was a message of death. Joseph apparently saw only in this an opportunity to get himself out of prison and probably go home to his father. He had no idea of what would eventually happen to him, but he saw in this a situation, a divine appointment. Here was a man who had the ear of Pharaoh. Here was a man who was close to Pharaoh, a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's household, and now Joseph was in the position to do him a favor, like the man who pulled the thorn out of the lion's foot in the fable, and then when he was thrown to the lion wouldn't eat him because he was his friend. Joseph sees a situation where he can do a favor to someone of a high rank and perhaps get this man to be his advocate before the Pharaoh to get him out of there so he could go home to his father. So he told the dream. The interpretation was favorable. And it says, when the chief bakers saw that the interpretation was good, he was encouraged to share his dream also. He said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head, meaning baskets of bread and so forth. He was the baker, so he would. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. That would be baked goods, pastries, and so forth. And the birds did eat them out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days, just like the 3 branches in the previous dream were 3 days. Yet within 3 days shalt Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee. Now, he had said to the other, the Pharaoh's going to lift up your head. And that meant he's going to elevate you. Now, he uses the same language here, but lift up the head means just the opposite. He's going to hang you. it says, the Pharaoh shall lift up your head from off thee and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Not a good interpretation. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the baker among his servants. He restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand again. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted them. But sadly, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so Joseph at that time had been in prison for 11 years, we later learn. But now he has another 2 years to wait as this man forgets the favor that was done to him. However, God brings it to the man's mind at the right time to remember. God's timing was in all of this. So we see that God set up this appointment where temporarily an innocent man in Pharaoh's court would be thrown into prison on suspicion of a crime that he had not committed, just so he would encounter Joseph. And this, of course, later brought Joseph the opportunity to have his name brought up before Pharaoh. I'm sure the butler wondered why he was accused. Why did God allow that to happen to him? But there was a purpose of God in it. Sometimes people suffer wrongfully and wonder why God permits it, but God will allow it sometimes because it is part of the fabric, one of the many threads woven into the whole picture of what God is doing in His sovereignty. Many people think that God is not to be credited for some of the bad things that happen to people, and it's only the devil. In this case, however, we see the hand of God through the whole situation. And it certainly should broaden our idea of of the sovereignty of God, that even many times the things that we would not choose that happen are very much in the purposes of God for our lives. We'll see more about this after we take our break and come back.